My name is Cassidy Harper, and I never imagined that a single argument at home could change my life forever. One afternoon, a moment that started as a typical disagreement ended with me crumpled on the floor, clutching my wrist, while my own mother screamed at me, "Stop being dramatic." I thought it was just another day in our tense household, but that moment spiraled into a nightmare that would involve the emergency room, social services, and a truth I could no longer keep hidden. If you've ever felt trapped in a home where fear and control overshadow love, my story will show you just how far it can go and how courage can finally set you free. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was 17 when it happened, tall for my age, with a mop of wavy brown hair that fell just below my shoulders, and a tendency to keep my thoughts to myself. I'd grown up in Greystone, Ohio, a small suburban town where everyone knew each other and appearances mattered more than reality. My mother, Lillian Harper, was a charismatic woman in the community, always dressed perfectly, with the smile that could charm anyone at a neighborhood gathering. But behind closed doors, her charm often turned into something suffocating and controlling. She had a temper that flared without warning, and a way of making me feel like every reaction I had was an overreaction. For years, I had learned to navigate her moods, tiptoeing around invisible boundaries, always careful not to make waves, as she liked to say. That afternoon started like any other. I had returned from school, tired and carrying the weight of assignments, college applications, and social stress. My mom was in the kitchen, sorting through papers on the counter, her brow furrowed. I tried to keep my head down, but she immediately launched into a lecture about my grades. I knew I had done better than usual on my last test, but it never seemed to matter. "Cassidy, why are you always so lazy? You think the world will hand you success on a silver platter?" she snapped, her voice tight and accusing. I opened my mouth to explain, to tell her I had studied hard, but the words caught in my throat because I knew she wouldn't listen. Not really. The argument escalated quickly. One comment led to another, and before I knew it, she was in my personal space, her face inches from mine, pointing her finger. I tried to step back, but she grabbed my wrist in a grip so tight I immediately winced. "Cassidy, stop whining. You're just being dramatic," she yelled. Pain shot through my arm, sharp and unmistakable, and I instinctively pulled away. But she shoved me, hard. My feet slipped on the linoleum floor, and I fell, twisting my right arm underneath me. The pain was instant, a burning ache that made me gasp and cry out. I could hear the clatter of dishes and the thud of my own body hitting the floor, and for a moment all I could think was that this couldn't be real. I tried to get up, but a searing pain in my wrist made me collapse again. Tears streamed down my face as I held my arm, my fingers trembling. "Mom, it hurts, please, it really hurts," I cried, hoping she would see reason. But instead of helping, she leaned over me, her expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Cassidy, stop being dramatic. You're fine. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Her words cut deeper than the pain. I realized then that the person who was supposed to protect me was dismissing my suffering, blaming me for my own injury. Fear began to replace the initial shock. I knew I needed help, but the thought of telling anyone else terrified me. My mother had always been charming in public. No one would believe me if I said she hurt me. And yet I couldn't ignore the pain. My wrist throbbed with every heartbeat, and my knuckles turned white as I gripped my arm. The house felt smaller, suffocating, and I felt a strange mix of anger and helplessness. How had our home, which should have been my safe place, become a place where I felt trapped and powerless? Eventually, I managed to stumble to the phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaking, barely above a whisper, but I explained that I had fallen and injured my wrist. When the operator asked if I was safe, I hesitated. The fear of consequences almost stopped me from speaking. But I knew that if I didn't reach out, no one would know the truth. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood. 2 paramedics arrived, calm but efficient, guiding me gently and asking questions as they assessed my wrist. At the hospital, the pain was overwhelming, but the kindness of the medical staff offered a small reprieve. The emergency room doctor, a stern but compassionate woman named Dr. Marlene Everett, examined my wrist with practiced hands. She said,
"This is a serious fracture," she quietly said, glancing at my mother, who sat stiffly nearby. I could feel the tension in the room as she asked me how it happened. I hesitated, unsure of how much to say, but the truth escaped my lips in a whisper. "My mom, she pushed me."
Dr. Everett's expression changed instantly. She didn't look angry or shocked. She looked concerned, protective. "Cassidy, we need to make sure you're safe," she said firmly, and I realized, in that moment, that this was bigger than just a broken wrist. For the first time, someone saw what I had been trying to hide, and it felt like a glimmer of hope amidst the fear. That glimmer, however, came with a new layer of dread. I didn't know what would happen next, but I sensed that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Life at home had always been a balancing act for me, a delicate dance where one wrong move could trigger an explosion. Before the incident with my wrist, I had spent years developing a system of self-preservation, learning which words to speak, which topics to avoid, and how to appear compliant while silently seething inside. My mother, Lillian Harper, had a way of dominating every conversation, steering every decision, and masking her control with charm when anyone else was around. To the neighbors and even some extended family, she was the model mother, organized, pleasant, involved, and seemingly full of love. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. My siblings and I learned to walk on eggshells, anticipating her moods, bracing for sudden anger, and suppressing our own needs in favor of survival. Growing up in Greystone had its pressures. It was a town where everyone knew each other's business, where appearances mattered more than reality. My mother thrived in this environment. She loved being admired, attending school events, hosting dinners, and volunteering at the local community center. She meticulously curated an image of perfection, and anyone who challenged it, my siblings, me, was promptly corrected, punished, or belittled. I had learned that expressing any emotion other than gratitude or obedience was risky. Complaining about her actions, standing up for myself, or asserting independence often resulted in verbal lashings or, in extreme cases, physical intimidation. The cycle was exhausting, and over time, I adapted by burying my feelings, retreating inward, and avoiding confrontation at all costs. Despite the fear, I had tried to carve out small pockets of autonomy. I spent hours in my room reading, journaling, or drawing, finding solace in worlds where adults didn't control every aspect of my life. I memorized the streetlights on my walk to school, the quiet corner of the library where no one could see me, and the few friends who could provide genuine support. But even those escapes were limited. At home, my mother had an uncanny ability to detect disobedience or dissatisfaction. She would question my whereabouts, scrutinize my phone, and even criticize my friends as bad influences. My safe spaces were always shadowed by her presence, and I grew skilled at pretending, at performing the version of myself she approved of, while quietly nurturing my own inner life that remained hidden from her eyes. The fracture in my wrist, however, ripped apart that fragile equilibrium. Suddenly, the mechanisms I had relied on for years were insufficient. My wrist ached constantly, making everyday tasks, writing, eating, even opening a door, painful and frustrating. I found myself dependent on my mother, the very person who had caused the injury, for care. Her reaction to my cries of pain was telling. She oscillated between dismissiveness and anger, insisting I was exaggerating, yet begrudgingly helping me with tasks when ignoring me wasn't possible. The situation forced me into an uncomfortable truth. I could no longer maintain the illusion of control. My injury had exposed the limits of my coping strategies, revealing how vulnerable I really was in an environment that was unsafe. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Even as I tried to navigate the immediate aftermath, I noticed subtle changes in my mother's behavior. She became hyper-aware of how others might perceive the situation. At the dinner table, she smiled tightly, telling my father that I had simply clumsily fallen, emphasizing that nothing malicious had occurred. But the tension in her shoulders, the sharpness in her eyes whenever I looked at her,
betrayed her underlying guilt, or perhaps her fear of being exposed. I felt a strange mixture of fear and power in observing this, knowing that I possessed the truth she desperately wanted hidden. It was an unspoken standoff. I held the reality of what had happened, and she wanted to suppress it at all costs. My school life also became a stage where the incident silently played out. Teachers noticed I was wearing a splint on my wrist and asked if I had been in an accident. I gave the rehearsed answer, "I fell at home." Most accepted it without question, but a few teachers gave me concerned looks, sensing there was more beneath the surface. At first, I tried to brush off their inquiries, fearing that even small admissions could escalate into danger if my mother found out I had spoken to anyone. Yet with each concerned glance, I realized I was living in a web of secrecy that was starting to suffocate me. I wanted to confide, to explain, to seek help, but the risk of retaliation kept my lips sealed.
The home environment, though, was never static. Every day was a delicate recalibration. I observed my mother's moods like a scientist, monitoring volatile chemicals. One wrong word, one unguarded glance, and the entire household could erupt. My father, Robert Harper, often retreated into passive observation, avoiding confrontations altogether. My younger brother, Ethan, was careful to mirror my strategy of silence, rarely questioning my mother and quietly retreating when tensions flared. Our family dynamic revolved around maintaining the facade of normalcy while individually managing anxiety, fear, and suppressed anger. In this environment, the fracture in my wrist symbolized more than a broken bone. It was a fracture in the carefully maintained equilibrium, a crack in the illusion that kept all of us functioning in fear. Even as I continued to recover physically, I noticed that the injury had a psychological ripple effect. I started flinching at sudden movements, hesitating when my mother approached, and mentally preparing myself for the next confrontation. Each small task became a negotiation. How to move without causing pain, how to avoid inciting anger, how to maintain appearances for anyone watching. The weight of unspoken truths settled heavily on me, an invisible burden that compounded with each passing day. And in the quiet moments, when I was alone in my room, the reality pressed on me. I could no longer ignore the hidden problem in my life. My home, which should have been a place of safety, had become a space of control, fear, and denial. I had reached the point where survival wasn't enough. I needed change. The breaking point came 2 weeks after my wrist incident, in a way I never could have anticipated. At first, I thought the pain would subside and life would somehow return to a semblance of normal. But the physical injury had barely begun to reveal the emotional and psychological toll it had taken on me. My mother, Lillian Harper, maintained her rigid control as usual, hovering over me whenever I tried to perform simple tasks like writing in my journal or pouring a glass of water. Each time I hesitated or winced from the lingering pain, she would scold me. "Cassidy, this is ridiculous. You're being dramatic again. Stop overreacting." Those words, repeated so often, had become a twisted echo in my mind, making me doubt not only the severity of my injury, but my own sense of reality. The day it all escalated started with a minor disagreement over dinner. My mother had insisted on making a strict menu plan for the week, and I, exhausted from school and the lingering effects of my fractured wrist, had accidentally knocked over a glass while reaching for a plate. The liquid spilled across the table and dripped onto the floor, and in that instant, I realized she wasn't going to see it as an accident. Lillian's face darkened, and I knew the storm was coming. "Cassidy," she yelled, pointing at the mess, "why are you so careless? Are you trying to ruin everything I've planned? You can't even do one simple thing right." My chest tightened and tears stung my eyes, not just from the shame of being scolded, but from the recognition that this pattern was unending. I tried to explain, my voice shaking. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," but she cut me off with a sharp slap across the back of my hand, the one with the still healing wrist.
Pain shot through me, and I yelped involuntarily. "Stop whining. You're fine. You always make such a big deal out of nothing," she screamed, her tone bordering on hysteria. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just a matter of control or strictness. It had crossed into something much darker. The fact that she could inflict pain on me, on purpose, or in moments of anger, and then dismiss it as overreaction, left me paralyzed with fear. The physical pain of my wrist made it impossible to ignore the seriousness of the situation. I could no longer pretend this was merely an exaggeration of her temper. The discomfort was constant, a burning reminder of the earlier fall and her unchecked anger. Every time she raised her voice or made a sudden movement near me, I flinched, my heart racing. In the past, I had been able to convince myself that if I stayed silent and obedient, I could avoid escalation. But now I understood that silence was no longer protective. It was enabling her behavior. I had reached a point where avoidance wasn't enough. I needed intervention. Later that evening, I retreated to my room, clutching a cold pack against my wrist and trying to collect my thoughts. I couldn't stop shaking, a combination of residual pain and the adrenaline from the incident. My father, Robert Harper, sat quietly in the living room watching television with an air of disengaged detachment, as he often did during conflicts between me and my mother. I had learned over the years that he rarely intervened, preferring to keep the peace by remaining neutral. I knew that if I were to tell him what truly happened, he might brush it off as another exaggeration, much like my mother insisted I was doing. My heart sank at the realization that I could not rely on him to validate my experience.
The next day, as I prepared for school, I noticed bruising forming around my wrist. Subtle, yet undeniable. I tried to hide it with a long-sleeved shirt, but the ache beneath my skin was impossible to disguise. That was when I began to consider outside help. I had always been fiercely independent, believing I could manage problems on my own. But now I realized the situation was unsustainable. I could no longer endure the daily fear, the physical pain, and the emotional manipulation without risking permanent damage, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Something had to change. At school, I confided a little to my close friend Maya Thompson, who had always sensed that something was off at home. "I think I might have to tell someone," I whispered, my voice low, almost trembling. Maya's eyes widened with concern, and she reached out to hold my hand. "Cass, you don't have to go through this alone," she said gently. "You should talk to the school counselor. They'll know what to do, and they can help." Hearing that gave me a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief because finally someone outside my family acknowledged that my experience was real and serious. Fear because acknowledging it meant stepping into the unknown, exposing myself to scrutiny, and possibly retaliation from my mother. That afternoon, I made a decision that would mark a turning point in my life. I walked into the school counselor's office, my wrist throbbing, my heart pounding. I recounted the incidents, describing not just the fall, but the patterns of fear, control, and intimidation that had characterized my life at home. My voice quivered at first, but as I spoke, a sense of clarity emerged. The counselor, Mrs. Ellen Fraser, listened intently, nodding and taking notes, never interrupting or questioning my truth. By the time I finished, she had a calm, professional demeanor that made me feel safe for the first time in years. "Cassidy, thank you for telling me. We're going to make sure you're safe and we'll involve the right authorities to help you," she said firmly. Hearing those words, I felt the first flicker of hope. I had stepped over the line from silence to disclosure, and while the consequences were still unknown, I understood that the old way, pretending everything was fine, enduring abuse in silence, was no longer viable. I was at the breaking point, the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored, and I had found someone outside my household willing to see it. That decision, terrifying as it was,
set in motion a series of events that would lead to intervention, confrontation, and ultimately the beginning of my freedom. The day the external eyes first focused on my situation started with an unexpected knock on the front door. I was home from school, still favoring my injured wrist, when the sound echoed through the house. My mother, Lillian, shot me a warning glance that was part anger, part fear, and stalked toward the door with her usual posture of controlled authority. I stayed in the hallway, uncertain of what was about to unfold, my heart pounding so violently it nearly matched the throbbing in my wrist. Standing on the porch were two women in professional attire, their expressions calm but serious. One of them introduced herself as Detective Angela Rivera and the other as a Child Protective Services investigator, Helen Park. Their presence was both shocking and terrifying, signaling that the hidden tension and control I had lived under for years was finally under scrutiny. My mother's initial reaction was a mixture of charm and defensiveness. She plastered on a polite smile, extending her hand with practiced ease. "Good afternoon, ladies. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice smooth but brittle at the edges. Inside, I could feel the weight of anticipation. I had rehearsed moments like this in my mind, but I was still unprepared for the intensity of the confrontation. Detective Rivera stepped forward, her demeanor professional yet approachable. "We received a report regarding a possible injury to Cassidy Harper. We're here to ask a few questions to ensure her safety," she said, glancing briefly at me. My stomach knotted. This was it. The outside world was finally seeing what I had been trapped in, and I could not hide anymore. My mother immediately launched into her defense, her tone shifting to controlled indignation. "There's been some misunderstanding. Cassidy is fine. She tripped in the kitchen and simply fell. Everything is perfectly under control," she said, emphasizing her words with small, deliberate gestures. But Detective Rivera's sharp eyes didn't miss the tension in my mother's posture, the subtle flinch when she noticed me holding my wrist, and the barely suppressed irritation in her tone. It was clear that no amount of charm or rehearsed explanation could completely mask the truth. I felt a surge of both fear and resolve. For years, I had been silenced, trained to tiptoe around my mother's moods. Now, with authority figures directly asking me questions, I knew I had a choice: continue to comply and protect her at my own expense, or speak honestly about what had happened. My voice quivered at first, small and tentative, but I began recounting the events: the fall in the kitchen, the shove, the immediate pain in my wrist, and the ongoing fear I felt at home. As I spoke, I noticed my mother's smile faltering, her hands tightening into fists at her sides.
Detective Rivera nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes, while Helen Park listened with an intensity that was almost reassuring. "Cassidy, thank you for telling us. It's important that you feel safe here, and we're going to make sure that happens," Helen said. I sensed that this wasn't just a formality. They were taking my words seriously, validating experiences I had long been told didn't exist. For the first time, I felt a mix of fear and relief, the kind that comes from stepping into the unknown but knowing it might finally offer protection. The investigation quickly expanded beyond that initial visit. Social services began reviewing my school records, interviewing teachers, and collecting evidence about the injury. I was asked to go to the hospital for a thorough examination, where doctors confirmed a clean fracture consistent with a fall, but also noted subtle bruising that suggested the possibility of more than just an accident. The medical report, combined with my testimony, began to build a factual foundation that no amount of denial or charm could erase. I remember feeling both anxious and vindicated as the pieces of the hidden truth were laid out on paper, ready to be scrutinized objectively. Back at home, my mother's demeanor shifted dramatically. She oscillated between pretending nothing had happened when visitors were present and unleashing quiet, simmering anger when she believed she was alone. I could see the tension in her jaw, the rigid posture, the barely contained frustration as she paced the living room. It was a strange mixture of fear and control.
She realized the walls she had built around her reputation were crumbling, and that the truth I'd carried was finally breaking through her carefully constructed facade. For me, it was empowering in small increments. Every observation of her unease reinforced that I was no longer invisible, that the narrative she had controlled for years was now contested. The first visit from authorities also forced me to confront the reality that speaking the truth came with consequences. My mother had already begun attempting to manipulate the narrative in subtle ways, whispering threats disguised as warnings. If you say the wrong thing, nobody will believe you. You'll ruin everything for yourself and the family. Her words were meant to terrify me, to push me back into silence. But the presence of Detective Rivera and Helen Park created a buffer I hadn't experienced before. I realized that external eyes seeing the truth mattered immensely. It could not be dismissed as mere exaggeration anymore. By the end of that first week under scrutiny, I felt a mix of empowerment, anxiety, and hope. My world was no longer contained entirely within the walls of fear my mother had constructed. There were witnesses, professional eyes, and documented evidence that could support my reality. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. My mother's attempts at control would escalate, and I would face resistance, manipulation, and intimidation. But the fact remained that I had crossed a line from private suffering to public recognition. That line, the moment external eyes began to see the truth, was the first step in reclaiming my life and safety. I had moved from silence and submission into visibility and action, and the consequences of that step would shape everything that followed. After the first official visits from authorities, the tension at home became unbearable, and I realized the opposition was already gearing up. My mother, Lillian Harper, had shifted into a more calculated form of control, one that combined outward politeness with private intimidation. She no longer shouted at me as often in public, knowing that outside eyes could catch her behavior, but behind closed doors, every movement I made was met with scrutiny. Every word I spoke analyzed and twisted into potential guilt. The atmosphere in our house grew stifling, thick with a sense of looming confrontation that seemed to follow me from room to room. Even my younger brother, Ethan, who usually kept to himself, would flinch if our mother's voice rose unexpectedly, signaling that the household had entered a new phase, the stage where control would be fought over with veiled tactics and psychological pressure. I tried to navigate the new reality carefully, balancing the need to cooperate with authorities with the constant threat of my mother's wrath. Every time I spoke to social workers or school counselors, I could feel her eyes on me, calculating, as though trying to memorize every detail, every nuance, to turn against me later. Her subtle manipulations began to intensify. She questioned my recollections repeatedly, claiming I was exaggerating or imagining the events. "Cassidy, are you sure you're remembering this correctly? You know how you tend to make things worse than they are," she said one afternoon, her tone silky but sharp. The doubt she planted gnawed at me despite knowing deep down that I was telling the truth. It was a mental battlefield. My confidence clashed with the fear that every word I spoke could be twisted into discrediting me. The emotional toll was immense. I started experiencing sleepless nights, replaying every incident in my head, analyzing how my words and actions might be interpreted, and anticipating my mother's next move. Even simple tasks became exercises in caution, opening my backpack, moving around the house, answering phone calls. My wrist, though slowly healing, remained a physical reminder of her power and the vulnerability I had felt. The pain was no longer just physical. It was a symbol of the ongoing psychological struggle. I realized that gathering evidence and maintaining honesty would require both courage and strategy, and that I could no longer rely solely on intuition or hope to protect myself.
School became both a sanctuary and a source of stress. Teachers noticed my repeated visits to the counselor's office and occasionally asked if I was okay. Some, like Mrs. Fraser, encouraged me to document every incident at home, every threat, every manipulation. I started keeping a detailed journal, recording dates, times, what was said, and how my mother reacted, even noting physical symptoms from the previous injury. Writing it down became a lifeline, a way to externalize the chaos and gain some semblance of control. But the act of documenting also reminded me of the stakes. If my mother discovered it, the repercussions could be severe. The tension between speaking the truth and protecting myself internally intensified with each passing day. At home, the battle for control became increasingly psychological. My mother alternated between passive-aggressive behaviors and direct manipulation, often using my younger brother as leverage. "Ethan, you see how dramatic your sister is? Don't be like her," she would say, her eyes flicking to me while he nodded silently. It was a deliberate strategy to isolate me, erode my confidence, and make me question the validity of my experiences. I felt my sense of self slowly being tested against her relentless insistence that I was the problem, that I had overreacted, and that the truth as I perceived it wasn't valid. Each of these moments built pressure, forcing me to weigh the consequences of speaking out versus remaining silent. Despite the mounting pressure, the external support remained a beacon. Detective Rivera and Helen Park continued to check in, ensuring I understood my options and that my voice was heard. Their presence reminded me that the evidence I had begun collecting, medical reports, journal entries, and witness statements, was building a case that could not be easily dismissed. Still, I knew my mother would fight back, likely attempting to manipulate, intimidate, or undermine me whenever possible. The opposition was real, relentless, and calculated, and I had to prepare mentally and emotionally for the battles ahead. It was during one particularly tense evening that I confronted my own internal conflict. I had been asked to recount the events yet again for a social worker, and as I repeated the story, my mother hovered nearby, silently observing, her expression carefully neutral. My confidence wavered for a moment. Doubts crept in. Had I remembered everything correctly? Would I be believed? Could I withstand her subtle psychological attacks? But then I looked at my wrist, still healing, and remembered the physical evidence of the truth. The injury was undeniable, a tangible proof that could not be dismissed. That realization anchored me, reminding me that I had to continue despite fear, that the truth itself was my strongest ally. By the end of that week, I recognized that this was no longer just about surviving day-to-day conflicts at home. The fight for truth had escalated into a test of resilience, requiring strategy, careful observation, and unwavering honesty. My mother's opposition was rising, her defenses growing more sophisticated, but so too was my resolve. I began to understand that the path forward would demand not just courage, but calculated persistence, that the accumulation of evidence, my own testimony, and support from external authorities were essential to confronting and ultimately overcoming the control she exerted over my life. Each small victory, each validated report, each acknowledgement from a professional reinforced the reality that I was not alone, and that the truth had a way of asserting itself even in the face of mounting opposition. The day the undeniable proof emerged felt surreal, like watching a slow-motion scene where every moment had been building toward this one moment. I was sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit examination room of Greystone General Hospital, my wrist still wrapped in a cast, when Dr. Marlene Everett entered with a folder of documents that made my stomach twist with anticipation. She gave me a reassuring smile, one that carried a seriousness I could not ignore. "Cassidy," she said, flipping through pages, x-rays, and photographs, "we've reviewed everything. The pattern of injury, combined with your detailed account and the observations from your school counselor, leaves no question that this was more than an accidental fall." My pulse quickened as I listened, absorbing every word, every implication. It was as if someone had taken the invisible weight I had carried for years and placed it squarely on paper, giving the world a record that could not be ignored. The x-rays alone told part of the story, the jagged lines of my fractured wrist visible like a map of my ordeal. But Dr. Everett's voice carried weight because it wasn't just about the bone. It was about the cumulative evidence, the bruising patterns, and the consistency of my account over multiple interviews. She explained that these injuries were consistent with repeated force, not a simple fall, her tone firm but gentle. Hearing her words, I felt a flood of conflicting emotions. Relief washed over me, knowing the proof existed, yet fear tightened in my chest as I considered how my mother might react once she learned that the medical documentation was now part of the official record. At home, the air seemed to change the moment the investigation documentation became real. My mother, who had always been adept at controlling appearances, suddenly became hyper-vigilant. She watched my every movement, her eyes flicking toward my wrist, toward the binder of school counselor notes I had kept hidden in my backpack, toward anything that might suggest I had prepared further evidence. One evening, she cornered me in the kitchen, her voice low but tinged with an edge that had me flinching. "Cassidy, I've heard from school that you've been telling tales about me. Do you understand what this could mean for our family?" she asked, trying to frame her control as concern. But I had seen the documents, felt the x-rays, heard the professionals. Her power over the narrative was slipping, and I could sense her panic beneath the polished exterior. The undeniable proof also shifted the dynamics with my father. Robert Harper, who had remained passive for so long, began to show subtle signs of awareness and acknowledgement. He would linger in the doorway during conversations about my recovery, ask cautious questions, and occasionally glance at my cast with a mixture of concern and hesitation. For years, he had avoided confrontation, deferring entirely to my mother's authority, but the concrete evidence disrupted the balance. He could no longer pretend that nothing had happened, that her actions were harmless, or that I was simply being dramatic. It was as if the proof had forced him to recognize a reality he had long chosen to ignore. School became a stage where the proof began to take on a life of its own. I submitted my journal entries, carefully documented incidents and statements from friends who had noticed subtle bruises or behavioral changes. Each piece of evidence reinforced the narrative I feared no one would believe. Teachers, counselors, and the school nurse began coordinating with social services, forming a network of support that validated my experience. I realized that the world outside my home was beginning to see what I had always known, that the hidden truth I carried was real, serious, and actionable. It was both empowering and terrifying to witness this shift. The truth I had been hiding for years was finally undeniable, yet the exposure meant my mother's reaction was unpredictable, potentially explosive. The turning point crystallized one afternoon when Detective Angela Rivera and Helen Park returned to the house for a follow-up. They had reviewed all medical records, corroborating accounts, and photographs. "Cassidy, you've done everything right by documenting this," Helen said kindly, her eyes meeting mine with unwavering seriousness. "The evidence is clear, and we're going to take steps to protect you." The weight of her words was immense. I felt as if I were standing at the edge of a precipice. One step forward could finally lead to safety, to intervention, to acknowledgement of the abuse I had endured. But it also meant there was no turning back. The truth was now out of my control in a way it never had been before. That evening, I returned to my room reflecting on how far I had come in the past few weeks. The fracture in my wrist had initially seemed a cruel accident, an injury that tied me to my mother's control. Now, it was a symbol of survival and a catalyst for exposure. The proof, the x-rays, the documented statements, the medical reports had transformed fear into possibility. I could feel the tension in my mother's absence, the quiet calculations she was making, the anticipation of how she might respond. But I also felt a seed of courage I didn't know I possessed, nurtured by the acknowledgement of professionals who believed me, and the realization that truth, once documented and undeniable, could no longer be hidden. That was the moment when I understood that my life had reached a turning point. The evidence had shifted the balance of power, making it impossible for my mother's denials to dominate the narrative. I had moved from private suffering to a public truth, from fear to a cautious, determined courage. And though the path forward was still uncertain, I now knew that I had the tools, the validation, and the support to continue confronting the abuse. This major revelation, proof that could not be disputed, was the spark that would propel me toward eventual safety and empowerment, marking the point where the hidden truth became undeniable, both to me and to the world around me. The moment of choice came quietly, yet it carried the weight of everything I had endured. I had spent countless hours hiding the truth, documenting incidents, gathering evidence, and hoping that somehow my mother would change, that somehow silence and compliance would keep me safe. But now, with the medical reports, x-rays, and corroborated accounts from friends and school staff in hand, the time for silence had passed.
The all-is-lost feeling had transformed into a clarity I hadn't felt before. If I continued to protect my mother by withholding the truth, I would be complicit in my own suffering. Every flinch, every anxious glance, every hidden tear reminded me that protecting her reputation had come at an unbearable cost to my own safety and sanity.
It began with a phone call from Helen Park, the Child Protective Services investigator. She asked if we could meet to discuss next steps, and I felt a twinge of fear immediately. My mother would be furious, and the confrontation at home would be inevitable. Still, I knew that agreeing to meet was the right decision. I could no longer hide in the shadows of fear. I told myself repeatedly that truth was no longer just an option, it was a necessity. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything I had endured. The sharp words, the shove that caused my fracture, the constant atmosphere of control and intimidation. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I could be safe, where my voice could be heard without the accompanying fear of punishment. The following morning, my mother immediately sensed a shift in my demeanor. She was unusually tense, making pointed remarks under her breath and following me around the house with a gaze that burned like fire. "Cassidy, don't even think about saying anything to anyone today," she warned, her voice low but threatening. But this time, her words didn't intimidate me the way they had before. I could feel the steel of resolve hardening in my chest. I had witnessed the proof. I had the validation from professionals. And most importantly, I understood that the cost of silence outweighed the temporary safety of compliance. When Helen Park arrived that afternoon, the confrontation became formal. My mother attempted her usual strategies: charm, manipulation, feigned concern. "I don't know why this is necessary," she said, pressing her hand to her chest as if wounded by the process itself. But Helen's presence, firm and professional, left little room for manipulation. I watched as my mother's expressions shifted subtly, her controlled facade cracking in microseconds that only someone paying close attention could notice. For the first time, I felt like an observer of her fear rather than a victim of it. I could see that the power dynamic had changed. I spoke first, my voice trembling initially, but gaining strength as the words came. I recounted every detail of the incidents, from the fall in the kitchen to the shove that caused my wrist fracture, to the constant psychological manipulation that had pervaded our household. I explained the fear I had lived with, the nightly anxiety, the isolation, and the careful strategies I had developed just to survive. Every word was a piece of armor, a declaration that I would no longer bear the burden of silence alone. My mother's eyes flicked between me and the investigators, her lips pressed tightly together, and for the first time, I sensed panic beneath the controlled exterior. When I finished, Helen Park leaned forward, her tone calm but unyielding. "Cassidy, you have done the right thing. This is a serious matter, and your courage in speaking out is being recognized and protected." Hearing her affirm my voice solidified the choice I had made. I realized that the all-is-lost moment, where the potential backlash, threats, and anger from my mother could have silenced me, was behind me. The moment I chose to speak fully and truthfully was also the moment I reclaimed my agency. The following days were intense. My mother attempted subtle forms of retaliation, hoping to undermine my credibility. She made passive-aggressive remarks around family members, attempted to isolate me, and tried to convince my younger brother that I was exaggerating. But the weight of the documented proof, the medical records, and the involvement of Child Protective Services created a protective barrier I had never had before. The external validation of my experience made it impossible for her to continue controlling the narrative entirely. I began to feel a strange sense of empowerment, even amid her calculated attempts to intimidate me. Even in private moments, I noticed a shift in my own perception of myself. The internalized fear and self-doubt that had dominated my thoughts for years were beginning to loosen. I had chosen the hard path, the path where speaking the truth could provoke anger and retaliation,
but it was the only path that offered the possibility of real safety and healing. Each day, as investigators visited and I participated in interviews, I felt the invisible weight of silence lifting, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of freedom. By the end of that week, I knew that the choice I had made to speak fully and stop protecting my mother's secrets had changed everything. The balance of power had shifted, the truth was visible and undeniable, and my voice was finally being heard in ways that mattered. I could not undo the past, nor could I predict all the consequences that would follow, but I understood that courage, honesty, and the willingness to risk fear for safety had created a turning point. I had stepped into the light of truth, and while the road ahead remained uncertain, I was no longer alone, and my story was no longer confined to shadows.
The mounting pressure hit almost immediately after I chose to speak the truth, like a storm breaking over a fragile coastline. My mother, Lillian Harper, had been simmering since the initial meetings with authorities, but once it became clear that my words, backed by evidence, were being taken seriously, her behavior escalated in intensity. She no longer attempted subtle manipulation or gentle intimidation. Now her tactics were direct, unrelenting, and often terrifying. It started with sharp, hushed comments in the hallways, moments when she would corner me with a fixed gaze and whisper threats meant to undermine my resolve. "You think this will end well for you, Cassidy? Do you really want to ruin everything for yourself?" she said one evening, her voice low but cutting, each word punctuated by the hint of danger I had felt so many times before. Despite her intimidation, I began noticing that her control was no longer absolute. Every time she raised her voice or tried to isolate me, there were witnesses, professionals who were actively monitoring the situation, and that gave me a small but growing sense of strength. One afternoon, while I was in my room reviewing the journal entries I had prepared for social workers, she burst in without warning, her eyes blazing. "You've gone too far, Cassidy. Do you understand what can happen to people who make false accusations?" Her tone was equal parts anger and desperation, a combination that revealed just how shaken she was by the undeniable evidence that had come to light. But I had rehearsed my response countless times. I looked her in the eyes and said, calmly but firmly, "I'm telling the truth. You can't change that." The words felt like a shield, a verbal armor forged from weeks of preparation and the growing awareness that my safety now depended on steadfast honesty. The escalation didn't stop there. Over the next several days, my mother attempted more overt forms of intimidation. She would follow me into every room, hovering as I completed homework, ate meals, or spoke on the phone with friends. She made pointed remarks to my younger brother, Ethan, aiming to turn him against me subtly. "Your sister is making things up. Don't be fooled by her stories," she warned, in a tone designed to instill confusion and doubt. It was a calculated psychological strategy, a manipulation intended to isolate me emotionally while attempting to regain control of the narrative. But the external oversight provided by Helen Park and Detective Rivera created a buffer that prevented her from going too far. Even as her threats escalated, I knew that the truth was on my side and that the documentation, medical records, and witness accounts were impossible for her to erase. At school, the mounting pressure manifested in indirect ways as well. Teachers and staff began noticing that I appeared anxious, frequently checking my wrist and occasionally flinching at sudden movements. They approached me privately, offering support and reminding me that I was not alone. One teacher, Mr. Daniels, who had taught me history for 2 years, asked if I needed additional help or protection, emphasizing that the school was committed to ensuring my safety. Their validation bolstered my courage, but it also highlighted the contrast between the world outside my home, where truth was recognized and respected, and the environment inside, where my mother's intimidation still lingered. The confrontation reached a peak one evening when I returned home from a follow-up medical appointment. My mother met me at the door, her face pale with controlled fury. "You've embarrassed me enough, Cassidy. You think everyone will believe you? Think again." Her words were sharp like knives, attempting to cut through the support network I had built. For the first time, I could see the real fear in her eyes. Fear of exposure, of consequences, of losing control over the carefully maintained image she had projected for years.
I realized that the intensity of her reaction was confirmation that my truth was powerful, undeniable, and destabilizing to her. It was a strange mix of terror and validation, understanding that the very threats meant to silence me were proof that I was finally making an impact. Even with the mounting pressure, I felt a subtle but growing shift within myself. Each threat, each attempt to intimidate me, reinforced the importance of maintaining clarity and resolve. I kept meticulous notes of every incident, documented the verbal intimidation, and shared updates with Helen Park and Detective Rivera, ensuring that every attempt to manipulate or instill fear was on record. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but it was necessary. I had learned that mounting pressure was an inevitable part of confronting someone who had long relied on control and fear. The challenge was not just surviving it, but using it as evidence to further support the truth I was revealing. By the end of that week, the pattern was clear. My mother's escalating intimidation, once unchecked, was now constrained by the growing weight of documented truth. Her threats, her attempts at psychological manipulation, her direct confrontations, all of it was mounting pressure that underscored the significance of the revelation. I was beginning to understand that facing intimidation required not only courage, but also a strategic approach, observing patterns, maintaining documentation, and seeking support from trusted authorities. It was an exhausting, high-stakes exercise in resilience, but it also illuminated something crucial. Truth, once undeniable, can withstand even the most calculated opposition.
The confrontation between truth and deception was intensifying, and I realized that the escalation was not a sign of weakness on my part. It was a necessary challenge, the kind that tests endurance, resolve, and the ability to persevere. Each interaction with my mother, though fraught with fear and intimidation, became a testament to the power of documentation, advocacy, and personal courage. I was learning, step by step, that standing firm in truth, even under direct assault, was not just a path to safety, but a declaration of self-worth and autonomy that could no longer be ignored. The aftermath of speaking the truth hit harder than I could have anticipated. It wasn't a single moment of crisis, but rather a relentless wave of consequences, both subtle and overt, that left me feeling isolated, terrified, and emotionally exhausted. At first, I had felt empowered, armed with evidence, validation from authorities, and the knowledge that my words could no longer be dismissed. But once the initial acknowledgement had passed, reality set in. Revealing the truth about my mother's abuse meant navigating a new world where fear, retaliation, and uncertainty became daily companions. Every time I crossed the threshold of our home, I felt the weight of her presence pressing down, like a storm cloud I could not escape. She escalated her tactics immediately after the social workers and police had left. Lillian Harper shifted between extreme silence and bursts of verbal aggression, creating an unpredictable environment that kept me on edge. One evening, she cornered me in the hallway, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Do you think anyone will care about your little stories? You'll see how fast everyone forgets you," she said, her words cutting deep. I could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline, the same fear that had dominated my childhood, but now it was tempered by the awareness that the authorities had seen, documented, and acknowledged the abuse. Even so, fear remained. I realized that telling the truth did not make me immune to retaliation. It only changed the battleground from secrecy to confrontation. The emotional toll was profound. Nights became unbearable as sleep evaded me, and every creak of the house reminded me of her presence. I replayed every conversation, every confrontation, questioning whether I had phrased things correctly, worried that a single misstep could be twisted against me. My wrist, still healing, throbbed not only from the physical trauma, but from the psychological stress. The invisible scars of living in a household dominated by control and intimidation began to merge with the visible evidence of my injury, reinforcing the inescapable reality that the consequences of speaking out were far from abstract.
Isolation weighed heavily as well. My friends, though supportive, could not fully understand the intensity of the scrutiny I faced at home. Even casual phone calls were fraught with the tension that my mother could overhear or manipulate. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, realizing that while professionals validated my experience, the people who had once been a daily part of my life could not intervene directly. The walls of our house, once merely the setting for fear and control, had become a psychological labyrinth where every interaction carried risk and every word could have ramifications I could not yet predict. School offered a temporary reprieve, but it also became a source of subtle pressure. Teachers would check in, asking if I was coping, encouraging me to continue documenting incidents, and offering guidance on how to interact with social workers and authorities. These conversations reminded me that I was not entirely alone, yet they also emphasized the stakes. The process of exposing the abuse was ongoing, and each action I took outside the home had to be carefully measured. I felt a constant tension between relief at external support and the dread of facing my mother again at the end of the school day. My mother's retaliation was not limited to words. Small acts of sabotage began appearing, my backpack moved without explanation, personal items tampered with, and subtle changes to my environment that signaled her awareness of my actions. Each incident, while minor in isolation, accumulated into a pervasive sense of dread that made me question my safety at home. The house, once familiar and seemingly secure, had transformed into a psychological labyrinth where every interaction carried risk and every word could have ramifications I could not yet predict. Despite the mounting challenges, I began to notice moments of clarity and resilience. The external validation I had received, the social workers, doctors, and school officials, remained a lifeline. I continued to document every interaction, every act of intimidation, every subtle threat, ensuring that a detailed record existed to counter my mother's attempts to manipulate. These efforts were both exhausting and empowering, a delicate balance between survival and asserting control over the narrative of my life. Slowly, I began to internalize the idea that my voice mattered, that the truth had a tangible power, even when faced with direct opposition. Yet the emotional lows were unavoidable. I cried in private, screamed in frustration when alone, and sometimes doubted my capacity to endure the relentless pressure. I felt guilt for my younger brother, Ethan, who often bore witness to the tension and struggled to understand the chaos around him. I wrestled with anger at my mother, sorrow for the life I had been forced to endure, and fear about what might happen next. The combination of psychological, emotional, and physical stress reached its peak during those weeks, leaving me exhausted and questioning whether telling the truth had been worth it.
And yet, in that darkest period, I discovered a quiet, stubborn resilience. I recognized that my suffering, though profound, had a purpose. It was the fuel driving documentation, the clarity in my testimony, and the motivation to protect not just myself, but others who might face similar circumstances. I realized that even in the deepest despair, the choice to speak out was creating ripples of change that could no longer be suppressed. The dark night of the soul had arrived, fully and without mercy, but it also marked a turning point. A recognition that survival required endurance, courage, and the unwavering commitment to truth, no matter how high the emotional cost. The final push arrived like a storm I had been anticipating for weeks, the culmination of every tense conversation, documented incident, and painstakingly recorded detail of abuse. It began with a formal meeting at Greystone Social Services, where my mother, Lillian Harper, was present along with social workers, the child protective investigator Helen Park, and Detective Angela Rivera. The room was neutral, but charged with an almost tangible tension, the kind that makes every heartbeat echo in your ears. I remember gripping my cast, knuckles white, reminding myself that this was the moment where all the preparation, documentation, and courage would finally be put to the test.
Every step I had taken over the past weeks, the journal entries, the medical records, the interviews, had led to this confrontation, where truth would face deception in a way that could not be ignored. My mother's demeanor shifted instantly as she stepped into the room. The carefully constructed facade of composure wavered as she scanned the professionals present, quickly attempting to reestablish control. "I don't see why this is necessary," she began, her tone polite but sharp, attempting to inject doubt and assert authority. "Cassidy's been dramatic. These accusations are overblown, and I think we're wasting everyone's time." The words were familiar, a replay of her manipulation at home, but here they were met with firm, unwavering eyes that refused to be swayed. Detective Rivera's glance held a subtle warning, a signal that the charade would not continue unchecked. I felt the fear rise again, but beneath it was a growing sense of clarity. I had come prepared, not just emotionally, but with evidence that left no room for denial. I spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting each act of aggression, manipulation, and intimidation, supporting every detail with medical records, x-rays, and journal entries. The room seemed to shrink around my words, the air charged with the intensity of confrontation. I could see my mother's expression tighten as the narrative unfolded, her attempts to control the story increasingly ineffective against the mounting proof. Each word I spoke felt like a brick laid in the foundation of my liberation, a declaration that the hidden truth could no longer be hidden. The turning point came when Helen Park presented the compiled documentation. Detailed records of my injuries, the verified x-ray images, corroborated statements from friends and school staff, and careful notes on my mother's attempts to manipulate both me and others. The evidence was indisputable. And for the first time, the professionals in the room spoke directly to my mother, their voices calm but unwavering. "Lillian Harper, these documents leave no room for doubt. Your attempts to deny or manipulate the truth cannot override the evidence we have collected. Cassidy's safety is our priority, and your actions have placed that safety at risk." For the first time, I saw panic in my mother's eyes, a flash of recognition that the power she had held over me for years was slipping irreversibly. She attempted to interject, trying to frame her behavior as care or discipline, but Detective Rivera cut in sharply. "The documentation is clear. Attempts to justify physical harm or psychological intimidation are unacceptable. This is not about drama or exaggeration. It is about undeniable evidence and the protection of a child." The room felt charged, every word reinforcing the finality of the confrontation. It was no longer a battle of perception. The truth had been codified in ways that could not be disputed, and every professional present understood the stakes. The atmosphere shifted as my mother realized the weight of the collective validation against her. She slumped slightly in her chair, a subtle acknowledgement that the confrontation was beyond her control. I could see her shifting her gaze between myself and the evidence, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear crossing her features. For me, the sensation was surreal. The person who had dominated my life through intimidation and control was finally confronted by an unassailable truth. I could feel the tension in my body ease slightly, knowing that the storm of confrontation, though emotionally taxing, was a necessary step towards safety and vindication. Throughout the session, my younger brother Ethan remained quiet but attentive. I noticed him glance at me several times, his eyes reflecting a growing awareness of the seriousness of the situation. For years, he had been shielded from much of the abuse or manipulated into believing I was overreacting. Now, in the presence of professionals and undeniable proof, he was witnessing a truth that had long been hidden. I felt a mixture of relief and responsibility. Relief that my experiences were finally being validated, and responsibility to continue advocating not only for myself, but for him as well.
By the end of the meeting, decisions were made regarding my immediate safety, future oversight, and the requirement for my mother to participate in mandated counseling and monitoring. The professionals outlined the consequences for continued intimidation or manipulation, establishing a formal structure that ensured I could begin to navigate life without constant fear.
Though the journey ahead remained challenging, the final push had shifted the balance decisively. The confrontation had not only validated my experiences, but had also created a formal framework to prevent further abuse and intimidation. As I left the building that day, the weight I had carried for years felt lighter, though not entirely gone. I had faced my mother, presented the truth, and endured the pressure of confrontation, and I had survived. The climax of this story was not a single moment of triumph, but the culmination of preparation, courage, and unwavering commitment to truth. In that formal setting, under the scrutiny of professionals and the undeniable weight of evidence, the narrative had shifted irrevocably. The truth had been heard, validated, and acted upon, marking the beginning of a new chapter in my life, where safety, voice, and empowerment could finally coexist. The resolution began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the days following the formal confrontation. While the immediate threat of physical harm had been addressed, the true sense of vindication came slowly in the small but profound ways my life started to shift. For the first time in years, I felt a tangible separation between the control my mother had once wielded and the agency I was beginning to reclaim. Social workers continued to check in, not just as observers, but as active supporters, ensuring that the boundaries established in the previous meetings were respected and enforced. Their presence was both a comfort and a reminder. The system, long distant and abstract, was now a tangible ally in my life, a structure that recognized the injustice I had endured and was committed to safeguarding my future. At school, the changes were equally profound. Teachers and counselors who had once offered cautious support now engaged with me openly, celebrating the courage it had taken to confront the abuse and maintain documentation of every incident. My academic performance, which had suffered under the weight of fear and stress, began to improve. I felt lighter in classrooms, freer to focus on studies rather than constantly calculating how to avoid my mother's scrutiny. The journal entries and statements that had once been a secret lifeline were now a record of courage that could not be dismissed. And I began to recognize the significance of my own voice, not just as a vehicle for survival, but as a tool of empowerment. The process of justice unfolded gradually, but definitively. My mother was required to attend mandated counseling sessions, monitored closely by social services, and restricted from unsupervised contact until evaluations deemed it safe. Every step of the way, the consequences of her actions were formalized, codified into a structure that reinforced accountability. While part of me still felt a deep sadness for the family I had once known, the overwhelming relief of seeing tangible consequences for abuse was undeniable. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The household dynamics that had once centered on fear and control were being dismantled by the weight of evidence and the careful oversight of professionals who understood the stakes. In private moments, I began to process the emotional aftermath. Therapy sessions helped me navigate the complex mixture of relief, anger, guilt, and empowerment that accompanied such a profound upheaval. I confronted lingering fears, revisited past traumas, and gradually began to integrate the experience into a narrative that emphasized resilience rather than victimhood. My wrist, once a constant physical reminder of abuse, had healed, leaving not just a scar, but a visible testament to survival and endurance. Each movement I made, each task performed without hesitation, became an act of reclaiming control over my own body, my own space, and my own life. My relationship with my younger brother Ethan also began to evolve. For years, he had been caught between loyalty to my mother and the undeniable reality of the abuse. With the interventions in place, we were able to speak openly, share experiences, and begin to rebuild trust.
I realized that our bond, tested under extreme pressure, had a foundation that could now grow stronger, based on truth rather than secrecy. The emotional weight of shielding him from the worst of our mother's behavior had been heavy, but together we began to navigate a path forward that emphasized safety, honesty, and mutual support. Socially, I felt a newfound confidence emerging. Friends who had noticed my struggles began to engage more fully, not just as bystanders, but as active participants in my recovery. I no longer felt the need to hide the truth from those who cared about me. My story could be shared, validated, and understood. The fear of judgment, once a constant companion, began to fade, replaced by the empowerment that comes from surviving trauma and reclaiming narrative control.
Even within my household, subtle changes were apparent. My mother's capacity to intimidate or manipulate had diminished significantly under the scrutiny and oversight now in place. While she still attempted minor forms of passive resistance, the structured boundaries enforced by social services, coupled with the ongoing monitoring of her behavior, ensured that my safety was no longer contingent on her goodwill or denial. I began to inhabit spaces in my own home with confidence rather than fear, understanding that empowerment was as much about external validation as it was about internal resolve. By the end of the first few months, a new equilibrium had emerged. It was not perfect, and the echoes of past trauma were never far, but the overarching sense of safety and justice had shifted the narrative of my life. I was no longer a passive participant in a household ruled by fear. I was an active agent, validated, heard, and protected. The journey toward healing was ongoing, but the foundation for a life built on truth, courage, and resilience had been firmly established. Looking back, the resolution was not a single dramatic moment, but a series of incremental changes that collectively transformed my existence. The confrontation, the formal acknowledgement of abuse, the consequences enforced on my mother, and the support from professionals and peers all converged to create a space where justice was not abstract. It was lived, tangible, and enduring. In reclaiming my voice, asserting my rights, and enduring the pressure of confrontation, I had achieved a victory that went beyond the superficial. It was a triumph of truth over deception, courage over fear, and resilience over control. The transformation was not instantaneous. It unfolded gradually, like the slow bloom of a flower after a harsh winter. In the months following the formal interventions, I began to see myself in a new light, one that had been impossible to recognize when fear and intimidation dominated every moment of my life. My name is Cassidy Harper, and the girl who once flinched at her mother's voice, who hid bruises and tears in silence, had begun to inhabit a world where her voice mattered, her experiences were validated, and her actions had tangible consequences. It was a new life, built on the foundation of truth and courage, one that offered the possibility of genuine peace and purpose. The physical reminders of my ordeal, the cast that had healed into a scarred but functional wrist, became a symbol of survival rather than a mark of victimhood. Every movement I made was a testament to resilience, a daily affirmation that I had endured violence and intimidation and emerged stronger. I began to embrace activities I had once avoided, reclaiming spaces where I could assert my autonomy and independence. Swimming laps at the local community pool, riding my bike through the quiet streets of my neighborhood, and practicing piano in my room without fear of interruption all became acts of empowerment. Each one reminded me that my body, once controlled by fear, now belonged to me entirely, capable of strength and agency. My relationship with my younger brother, Ethan, deepened in ways I had longed for but had never fully experienced. No longer caught in the crossfire of manipulation, he and I shared moments of honest connection, discussing our feelings, our fears, and our hopes. We laughed together, cried together, and began creating memories that were not shadowed by intimidation. I recognized that the protective role I had taken on for years could now be shared, that our bond could grow in an environment of safety rather than constant vigilance. This new dynamic reinforced my sense of purpose.
The truth I had fought to reveal not only safeguarded my life, but also offered a shield for the people I cared about most. School became a stage for renewed ambition. Freed from the emotional burden of hiding, I was able to excel academically and socially, pursuing opportunities I had once shied away from. Teachers encouraged me to mentor younger students who might be experiencing challenges at home, recognizing that my lived experience offered empathy and guidance that could be transformative. I began to see my story as a tool, not just for my survival, but for helping others navigate the complexities of fear, abuse, and recovery. Every interaction reinforced a sense of purpose. The pain I had endured could be transformed into meaningful action, guiding and inspiring others to find their voices. Therapy sessions continued, not as a place of crisis, but as a space for growth. I explored the layers of trauma, identified coping mechanisms, and began to process long-suppressed emotions. My therapist encouraged me to document progress, reflect on accomplishments, and envision a future shaped by choice rather than circumstance. Over time, the overwhelming anxiety that had once accompanied every interaction with my mother diminished, replaced by a calm determination and awareness that my safety and autonomy were non-negotiable. I began to internalize the lessons I had learned. Courage is cultivated through action. Empowerment comes from truth, and resilience is forged in the crucible of adversity. The transformation extended into my social environment as well. Friends and extended family, who had once been peripheral observers, became active participants in my recovery and celebration of newfound freedom. They recognized my strength and validated my choices, offering companionship, encouragement, and understanding. I began to embrace social events, extracurricular activities, and volunteer opportunities without the constant fear of manipulation or interruption. Each interaction reinforced the reality that life could be filled with genuine connection and joy, free from the shadows of past abuse.
Perhaps most profoundly, I began to envision a purpose beyond personal survival. I engaged in outreach programs, speaking anonymously in some settings, openly in others, to educate peers about recognizing abuse, documenting incidents, and seeking help. I realized that the experience that had once isolated me could be transformed into a beacon for others navigating similar challenges. Empowerment became both personal and communal. I was no longer merely surviving. I was actively creating change, offering guidance, and demonstrating that the power of truth can reshape lives. By the time my rest had fully healed and the formal oversight measures had stabilized the household environment, I had reached a new equilibrium. The fear that had once dominated my existence had been replaced by confidence, resilience, and a sense of mission. My mother's ability to intimidate had been curtailed by accountability measures, and the structures in place ensured that I could live with autonomy and dignity. In those quiet moments, when I reflected on the journey from secrecy, fear, and suppression to clarity, courage, and purpose, I recognized that the transformation was complete, not as a single victory, but as a cumulative process of truth, action, and endurance. The final image of my journey is not a dramatic confrontation or a single triumph, but a moment of serene empowerment. I stand in my room, sunlight streaming through the window, wrist healed and strong, journal in hand, reflecting on the path I have traversed. I am no longer a silent victim of circumstances. I am Cassidy Harper, a survivor, an advocate, and a young woman whose voice matters. The hidden truths that once threatened to consume me have become the foundation for empowerment, hope, and purpose. My story, once a secret burden, has become a testament to the power of courage, the resilience of the human spirit, and the undeniable strength that emerges when truth finally prevails. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.